On the morning of November 25, 1989, a mailman named Earl Tucker drove his usual route down Miller's Creek Road in Danby, Vermont. He'd been delivering mail to the Peacock farm for 17 years. He knew the routine. George would be in the barn by 6. Catherine would have coffee brewing by 7. The dogs would bark when his truck pulled into the driveway, and Catherine would wave from the kitchen window. But that morning, nothing was routine. The dogs weren't barking. The kitchen window was dark. George's pickup truck sat in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of frost that said it hadn't moved in days. And when Earl walked up to the porch to leave a package, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The front door was wide open, and there was blood on the threshold. If you think you know what happened to George and Catherine Peacock, I promise you, you don't. This story has more twists than that dirt road leading to their farm. A disappearance that haunted a community for decades. A woman everyone thought was dead who was actually alive. A monster hiding in plain sight who thought he'd escaped justice forever. And an arrest that came 23 years after everyone had given up hope. Stay with me until the final chapter, because what was discovered in that farmhouse and what happened in a courtroom in 2012 will change everything you think you know about justice, about survival, and about the secrets we bury in the places we call home. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe now, because you're going to want to know how this ends. And trust me, you won't see it coming. My name is Thomas Whitmore. George Peacock was my grandfather. Catherine Peacock was my grandmother. And for 23 years, my family believed they were both dead, murdered by an intruder, victims of a random act of violence that shattered our family and left a wound that never healed. We were wrong about almost everything. Danby, Vermont, in 1989, was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked. Population just over 1,000 souls, nestled in the Green Mountains like a secret the world had forgotten to discover. The main street had a general store, a white-steepled church, and a diner where the same people sat in the same booths every single morning, talking about weather and crops, and absolutely nothing of consequence. The Peacock farm sat 3 miles outside of town, at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every spring and ice every winter. 40 acres of rolling pasture, a red barn that had seen better days, and a white farmhouse with green shutters that my great-great-grandfather had built with his own hands in 1902. 4 generations of Peacocks had been born in that house. 4 generations had worked that land. And 4 generations had learned the same lesson. What happens in this family stays in this family. That lesson was about to be broken forever. When Earl Tucker called the police that November morning, he set off a chain of events that would consume Danby for months. Sheriff Harold Brennan arrived within 20 minutes, followed by 2 deputies and an ambulance that would turn out to be unnecessary. There were no bodies to transport. There were no victims to save. George and Catherine Peacock had simply vanished. The blood on the threshold was real. Type O positive, matching George's blood type. There was more inside the house. Spatters on the kitchen wall. A pool of it near the back door. Enough blood, the forensic experts said, to suggest that someone had been seriously injured, possibly killed. But there were no bodies. Sheriff Brennan searched the property for 3 days. They brought in dogs. They dredged the pond behind the barn. They combed through 40 acres of fields and forest, looking for freshly turned earth, looking for any sign of where George and Catherine Peacock might have gone. They found nothing. The investigation stalled almost immediately. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no motive that anyone could determine. George Peacock was a respected member of the community, a town council member, a church deacon. Catherine was a quiet, devoted wife who kept to herself but was always pleasant when you saw her in town. Who would want to hurt them? Why would anyone target this ordinary farm couple in this ordinary small town? The questions multiplied, but the answers never came. Within 6 months, the case went cold. The file gathered dust in the sheriff's office. The people of Danby whispered theories to each other. Home invasion, robbery gone wrong. Maybe George had gambling debts nobody knew about. But eventually, even the whispers faded. Life moved on. The Peacock farm sat empty, slowly falling into disrepair, a monument to an unsolved mystery that everyone preferred to forget. My mother, Margaret Peacock, was 32 years old when her parents disappeared. She was living in New York City at the time, working as a paralegal, trying to build a life far away from the farm where she'd grown up. When she got the call from Sheriff Brennan, she collapsed. When she arrived in Danby 3 days later, she walked through the farmhouse like a ghost, touching her mother's things, sitting in her father's chair, trying to understand how her parents could simply cease to exist. She never recovered. Not really. For the rest of her life, my mother carried the weight of that unsolved mystery. She hired private investigators. She called the sheriff's office every month for updates that never came. She kept her parents' bedroom exactly as they'd left it, frozen in time, waiting for a resolution that seemed impossible. I grew up in the shadow of that tragedy. I grew up hearing stories about grandparents I'd never known, about a farmhouse I'd never visited, about a mystery that had broken my mother's heart. I grew up believing that my grandparents had been victims, innocent people killed by some random act of evil. I believed that until 2011, when everything changed. That's when a woman named Catherine Monroe walked into a police station in Portland, Oregon, and told them she had information about a cold case from Vermont. A case involving a couple named George and Catherine Peacock. A case that had gone unsolved for 22 years. She told them she had information because she was Catherine Peacock, and she was ready to tell the truth about what had happened that night. And more importantly, she was ready to tell them where to find George. I need to take you back now. Back to who Catherine really was, and what she endured for 35 years before that November night. Because without understanding what my grandmother survived, you can't understand why she did what she did, or why she waited 22 years to come forward. Catherine Marie Sullivan was born in Boston in 1935, the youngest of 5 children in an Irish Catholic family that had just enough money to be respectable and not enough to be comfortable. Her father worked at the shipyard. Her mother took in laundry and ironing. Catherine was the dreamer of the family, the one who read books and wrote poetry and believed, with all the foolish hope of youth, that love would save her from a life of drudgery. She met George Peacock at the Eastern States Exposition in September of 1953. He was 22 years old, handsome in a rough-hewn way, with broad shoulders and a charming smile. He told her about his farm in Vermont, about the mountains and the meadows and the peaceful life he lived there. He made it sound like paradise. He made himself sound like a prince. They married 6 months later, and Catherine left everything she knew to follow a man she barely understood to a place she'd never been. Her mother cried at the wedding. Catherine thought they were tears of joy. She was wrong about a lot of things back then. The first time George hit her was 3 weeks after the wedding. She'd overcooked the roast. He apologized for hours afterward, wept, promised it would never happen again. Catherine believed him. She wanted to believe him. Because if she didn't believe him, then she'd made the worst mistake of her life, and she was only 19 years old. The second time was a month later. The third time was a week after that. By their first anniversary, Catherine had stopped counting. She'd stopped believing George's apologies too. But by then, she was pregnant with their first child, and where was she supposed to go? Back to Boston, in disgrace, to parents who would ask what she'd done to make her husband so angry? This was 1955. Women didn't leave their husbands. Women endured. And so Catherine endured. She endured 35 years. What she didn't tell anyone, not even her children, was that she was documenting everything. From the very first beating, Catherine kept a journal. She wrote down dates, times, injuries. She described George's moods, his triggers, his methods of control. She noted when he was kind and when he was cruel, when he was sober and when he was drunk. By 1989, she had 43 leather-bound notebooks hidden in a secret space in the attic. 35 years of testimony. Every bruise. Every broken bone. Every night George locked her in the root cellar as punishment for imaginary offenses. Every lie he told to the neighbors, to the church, to the town council. The journals were her lifeline, her proof, her weapon, waiting to be used. But they weren't just evidence of abuse. They were evidence of something far worse. In 1988, Catherine made a discovery that changed everything. She found old letters hidden in George's desk. Letters from a young woman named Eleanor Marsh, dated 1952, the year before George and Catherine had met. Eleanor's letters were love letters. Hopeful, naive, full of dreams about a future with George Peacock. The last letter was dated October 15, 1952. Eleanor wrote about meeting George at a dance hall that weekend. She wrote that she couldn't wait to see him. Eleanor Marsh had disappeared that weekend. Her body was never found. Catherine searched for more information. She found newspaper clippings George had saved, articles about Eleanor's disappearance. She found a photograph of Eleanor, young and beautiful, with a handwritten note on the back, "To George, with all my love." And she found one more thing, a small jewelry box, hidden at the bottom of George's desk drawer. Inside was a locket. Catherine recognized it from Eleanor's photograph. She'd been wearing it in the picture. George had killed before. Catherine was certain of it. And she realized that if she didn't escape, if she didn't find a way out, she would eventually end up like Eleanor Marsh, a missing woman whose body was never found. That's when she started planning in earnest. Let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. If you discovered that your spouse had likely murdered someone before you even met, if you realized that you were living with a killer who could end your life at any moment, what would you do? Would you go to the police with evidence from almost 40 years ago? Would you try to run? Would you stay silent and hope for the best? Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think you would do. Because my grandmother made her choice, and it would take 22 years for anyone to understand why. Catherine knew she couldn't go to the police. Not yet. She had no proof that George had killed Eleanor, just suspicions and circumstantial evidence. And if she accused George without proof, he would kill her before she could take another breath. She needed to escape first, get to safety, and then find a way to bring George to justice. Through a lawyer she contacted secretly in Burlington, a woman named Patricia Sinclair who specialized in domestic violence cases, Catherine made contact with a man named Victor Reyes. Victor specialized in relocations, new identities, disappearances. The plan was simple. Victor would help Catherine escape. He would give her a new identity, a new life, somewhere George would never find her. And once she was safe, once she was beyond George's reach, she would find a way to expose him for what he really was. But Catherine didn't just want to disappear. She wanted to leave evidence behind. Evidence that would eventually lead investigators to the truth about George Peacock. She left the journals in the attic. 43 notebooks documenting 35 years of abuse. And among those notebooks, she left the letters, the newspaper clippings, and the photograph of Eleanor Marsh. She left a trail she knew someone would eventually follow. November 25, 1989 was the night Catherine's plan went into action. The day before her escape, Catherine made her final preparations. She packed a small bag with only the essentials. She transferred what money she could access to an account Victor had set up for her in another state. She wrote letters to her children that she would never send, explaining why she had to leave, begging them to forgive her. And she wrote one final entry in her journal. "Tomorrow, I leave this prison forever. Tomorrow, I start my life again. Whatever happens to George, he brought it on himself. And someday, when it's safe, I will come back. I will tell the truth. And George Peacock will finally face justice for everything he's done. To me, to Eleanor Marsh, to everyone he's ever hurt." That evening, George came home from the barn in a foul mood. He'd been drinking. Catherine could always tell by the way he walked, the particular set of his shoulders, the coldness in his eyes. She prepared dinner as usual, moving carefully, quietly, trying not to trigger him. It didn't work. George found fault with everything. The meat was overcooked. The potatoes were cold. The house was dirty. Catherine was useless. By the time he finished his tirade, Catherine was backed against the kitchen counter, George's face inches from hers, his breath hot with whiskey. "You're nothing," George hissed. "You've always been nothing. And you'll die nothing. Right here in this house. Just like you deserve." In that moment, Catherine made a decision. She wasn't going to wait until tomorrow. She wasn't going to spend one more night in this prison. She was leaving tonight. "I know about Eleanor," she said quietly. George froze. "I know what you did to her. I found the letters. I found the locket. I know you killed her, George. And I have proof." For a moment, George didn't move. His face went white. His hands trembled. And then something changed in his eyes. Something dark and terrible and final. "You shouldn't have said that," he whispered. He lunged at her, his hands wrapped around her throat. Catherine gasped for air, clawing at his fingers, feeling consciousness slip away. She thought this was it. After 35 years of survival, she was going to die in this kitchen, just like George had promised. But Victor Reyes was watching from outside. The back door exploded inward. Victor, a big man with military training and hands like sledgehammers, grabbed George from behind and threw him across the room. George hit the wall hard and slumped to the floor, dazed but not unconscious. "We need to go," Victor said, grabbing Catherine's arm. "Now." But George wasn't finished. He staggered to his feet, grabbed a knife from the counter, and charged at Victor. The two men struggled, crashing into the table, sending dishes flying. Catherine watched in horror as George slashed at Victor, cutting his arm, drawing blood. Victor responded with brutal efficiency. He disarmed George, threw him to the floor, and delivered a devastating blow to his head with a cast-iron skillet. George went down and didn't move. Blood pooled around his head. So much blood. "Is he dead?" Catherine whispered. Victor checked for a pulse. "No, but he will be if we don't get him help." Catherine looked at her husband, the man who had terrorized her for 35 years, the man who had murdered Eleanor Marsh, lying on the floor with his skull cracked open. Part of her wanted to leave him there. Part of her wanted to watch him die. After everything he'd done, didn't he deserve it? But Catherine wasn't a killer. No matter what George had done to her, she couldn't become like him. "Call an ambulance," she said, anonymously. "Then get me out of here. If he survives, he'll come after you," Victor warned. "No, he won't, because I'm leaving the journals behind. The moment anyone finds them, George will have bigger problems than finding me." Victor made the call. Then he took Catherine to his car, and they drove away into the night, leaving George Peacock bleeding on the kitchen floor. Catherine didn't look back. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The ambulance was delayed. A truck had jackknifed it on the main road, blocking traffic for hours. By the time emergency services reached the farmhouse, it was empty. George was gone. Someone else had been watching that night. Someone else had seen what happened. And someone else had taken George before the ambulance could arrive. His name was Daniel Marsh, Eleanor's brother, and he'd been waiting 40 years for this moment. Daniel Marsh was 16 years old when his sister disappeared in 1952. She was 18, beautiful, full of life and hope. And then she met George Peacock. Daniel never believed the official story. He never believed Eleanor had run away. He knew, with the certainty that only a brother could have, that something terrible had happened to her. And he knew George Peacock was responsible. But he couldn't prove it. George's family had connections. The investigation went nowhere. And Daniel was left with nothing but questions and a lifetime of grief. He never stopped looking for the truth. Daniel followed George's life from a distance for almost 40 years. He watched George marry Catherine. He watched from afar as George built his respectable facade in Danby. He suspected George was abusing Catherine, saw the signs that others missed, but he had no way to intervene without exposing his own obsession. He was waiting for proof, waiting for justice, waiting for the right moment. On November 25, 1989, that moment finally came. Daniel had been watching the farmhouse that night. He saw Victor Reyes arrive. He saw the struggle through the kitchen window. He saw George go down. And he saw Catherine and Victor flee into the darkness. Then he waited. He watched the kitchen, expecting the ambulance to arrive. But the ambulance didn't come. And George, incredibly, was still moving. Daniel could see him through the window, crawling across the floor, trying to reach the phone. Daniel made a decision. A decision he'd been waiting 40 years to make. He walked into the farmhouse. He stood over George Peacock, looking down at the man who had stolen his sister's life. George looked up at him with blood-filled eyes, confused, terrified. "Who are you?" George gasped. "My name is Daniel Marsh. Eleanor was my sister." George's eyes went wide with recognition. And fear. It wasn't. "Don't lie to me." Daniel's voice was cold, controlled, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "I know what you did. And tonight, you're going to tell me where you buried her." Daniel had come prepared. He had rope, duct tape, a tape recorder. He bound George's hands and feet. He stopped the bleeding from George's head wound, just enough to keep him alive. And then he loaded George into the trunk of his car. He drove north, to an old hunting cabin his family owned in the mountains. A place no one knew about. A place where no one would hear George scream. For 3 days, Daniel kept George in that cabin. He didn't torture him, not physically. He didn't need to. George was badly injured, terrified, and completely at Daniel's mercy. All Daniel had to do was wait. On the 3rd day, George broke. He confessed everything. The murder of Eleanor Marsh, where he had buried her body. Every detail of that night in 1952 when he had strangled a young woman whose only crime was loving him. Daniel recorded every word. And then Daniel faced a choice. The same choice Catherine had faced in that kitchen. He could kill George, end his miserable life, and avenge Eleanor once and for all. No one would ever know. George would simply disappear, another cold case that would never be solved. But Daniel was not a murderer. Despite everything George had done, despite the rage that had consumed Daniel for 40 years, he couldn't cross that line. Instead, he did something unexpected. He kept George alive. He kept him prisoner in that cabin, nursing his wounds, feeding him, making sure he survived. And he waited. Why? George asked one night, weeks into his captivity. Why don't you just kill me? Daniel looked at him with cold eyes. Because death is too easy. You deserve to suffer. You deserve to spend the rest of your life in a cage, knowing that everyone knows what you did. You deserve to face a courtroom and see the families of your victims staring at you while a judge sentences you to die behind bars. No court will believe you. George spat. It's been 40 years. There's no evidence. Daniel smiled grimly. There will be. Someday, someone will find the evidence. Catherine's journals. Eleanor's locket. The truth will come out. And when it does, I'll be ready. Daniel kept George prisoner for 22 years. 22 years in that remote cabin in the mountains. 22 years of isolation, of waiting, of knowing that justice was coming but never knowing when. It was a life sentence, served in solitary confinement, without a trial. But Daniel was waiting for more than just evidence. He was waiting for Catherine to come forward. He'd tracked her down years ago, discovered her new identity in Oregon. He knew she was alive, and he knew that when she was finally ready, she would tell the truth. In 2011, Daniel got word that Catherine was dying. Cancer. She had months to live, and she had decided that before she died, she would come forward. She would tell the police everything, and Daniel would finally deliver George Peacock to face the justice system. On March 15, 2011, Catherine Monroe, formerly Catherine Peacock, walked into the Portland Police Department and asked to speak to a detective. She was 76 years old, frail from cancer, but her eyes were clear and her voice was steady. My name is Catherine Peacock, she said. I disappeared from Danby, Vermont in 1989. Everyone thinks I'm dead, but I'm not. And I have information about my husband, George Peacock. Information the police need to hear. The detective, a woman named Sarah Chun, listened in shock as Catherine told her story. The abuse. The journals. The discovery of Eleanor Marsh's letters. The escape. Victor Reyes. Daniel Marsh. Wait, Detective Chin interrupted. Are you saying George Peacock is alive? That he's been held captive for 22 years? Catherine nodded. Daniel Marsh has him. He's been keeping him alive, waiting for this moment. Waiting for me to come forward so George could face a proper trial. That's kidnapping. That's unlawful imprisonment. Daniel Marsh is a criminal. Daniel Marsh saved my life, Catherine said quietly. If he hadn't taken George that night, George would have recovered. He would have come after me. He would have killed me the way he killed Eleanor. Daniel kept me safe for 22 years. Whatever crimes he committed, he did them to protect me and to ensure that George faced justice. Detective Chin sat back in her chair, trying to process what she was hearing. Where is Daniel Marsh now? Where is he keeping George? Catherine handed her a piece of paper, an address in the mountains of northern Vermont. The location of Daniel's cabin. George is there. Daniel is expecting you. He'll surrender peacefully. All he asks is that George be arrested and prosecuted for the murder of Eleanor Marsh, and for the decades of abuse he inflicted on me. Detective Chun made a phone call. Then another. Within an hour, the FBI was involved. Within 2 hours, a team was being assembled to raid Daniel Marsh's cabin. What they found there would shock the nation. The cabin was small, remote, accessible only by a dirt road that was impassable in winter. When the FBI team arrived, Daniel Marsh was waiting on the porch, his hands raised in surrender. "George is inside," he said calmly. "He's alive. I've kept him healthy for 22 years. He's ready to face justice." The agents went inside and found George Peacock in a locked room at the back of the cabin. He was 80 years old, gaunt and pale from years of captivity, but alive, lucid, and terrified. "Help me," George begged the agents. "That man is insane. He's kept me prisoner for decades. I haven't done anything wrong. Please, you have to help me." But the agents had already been briefed on what Catherine had told Detective Chun. They weren't here to rescue George Peacock. They were here to arrest him. "George Peacock," the lead agent said, pulling out handcuffs. "You are under arrest for the murder of Eleanor Marsh in 1952. You are also under arrest for assault, unlawful imprisonment, and domestic violence against Catherine Peacock spanning a period of 35 years. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." George's face went white. "You can't prove any of that. It was 50 years ago. There's no evidence." The agent smiled grimly. "Actually, Mr. Peacock, there's quite a lot of evidence. Your former wife kept journals documenting every crime you committed, and we have a tape recording of you confessing to the murder of Eleanor Marsh. The confession you gave to Daniel Marsh 22 years ago." George Peacock was dragged out of that cabin in handcuffs, screaming protests that no one believed. After 59 years of evading justice, after decades of abuse, and at least one murder, George Peacock was finally in custody. Daniel Marsh was arrested too. Kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, a host of other charges. He didn't resist. He didn't complain. He simply looked at the agents and said, "It was worth it. Every day of the last 22 years was worth it to see that monster in handcuffs." The trial of George Peacock began in September 2012 and became a national sensation. Journalists descended on the small Vermont courthouse from every major network. Legal experts debated the unprecedented nature of the case. Victim advocates hailed Catherine Peacock as a hero. And the people of Danby, who had spent 23 years believing the Peacocks were victims of random violence, struggled to comprehend the truth. George faced 2 separate sets of charges. First, the murder of Eleanor Marsh in 1952. Second, the decades of abuse he had inflicted on Catherine. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had Catherine's journals, 43 notebooks documenting 35 years of abuse in meticulous detail. Dates, times, injuries, witnesses. A record so comprehensive that defense attorneys couldn't find a single inconsistency. They had the tape recording of George's confession to Daniel Marsh. George's own voice, admitting to strangling Eleanor Marsh and burying her body in a wooded area near Rutland. Forensic teams had already recovered Eleanor's remains from the location George described. They had Eleanor's locket, which George had kept as a trophy for 60 years. They had medical records showing Catherine's injuries over the years, broken bones, concussions, wounds that doctors had accepted at face value when George explained them away as accidents. They had testimony from Robert Peacock, Catherine's youngest son, who flew in from California to describe the violence he had witnessed as a child. They had testimony from Margaret Peacock, my mother, who wept on the stand as she recounted years of watching her father terrorize her mother. And they had Catherine herself. Catherine testified for 3 days. She was dying, everyone knew that, but her voice never wavered. She sat in that witness box and told the jury everything. The first beating, 3 weeks after her wedding. The night George locked her in the root cellar and left her there for 12 hours. The broken arm he'd caused, and the lies he'd forced her to tell the doctor. The discovery of Eleanor's letters and the realization that she was married to a murderer. She told them about the night she escaped, about Victor Reyes, about her 22 years in hiding, living in fear that George would somehow find her. And she told them why she'd finally come forward. "I'm dying. Catherine said, looking directly at the jury. "I have maybe 6 months left. And I realized that if I died without telling the truth, George would get away with everything. Eleanor Marsh would never get justice. My children would never understand what really happened. And other women who are living the nightmare I lived, would never know that escape is possible, that justice is possible, even if it takes 50 years. The defense tried everything. They claimed Catherine's journals were fabricated. They argued that Daniel's 22 years of captivity had psychologically damaged George, making his confession unreliable. They painted George as the real victim, a confused old man who had been kidnapped and held against his will. Nobody believed them. George took the stand in his own defense. It was a catastrophic mistake. Under cross-examination, he lost his temper. He called Catherine a liar. He called Eleanor a tramp who got what she deserved. He sneered at the prosecutor and insulted the judge. By the time he finished testifying, any sympathy the jury might have felt had evaporated. On October 17, 2012, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree for the killing of Eleanor Marsh. Guilty of assault in the first degree for the abuse of Catherine Peacock. Guilty of assault in the second degree. Multiple counts. Guilty of unlawful imprisonment. Multiple counts. Guilty of reckless endangerment. Guilty on every single count. George Peacock sat motionless as the verdicts were read. He was 81 years old. He had spent the last 22 years in captivity, and now he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Judge Eleanor Walsh, a stern woman who had presided over the trial with unwavering professionalism, addressed George directly. "Mr. Peacock, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case as disturbing as this one. You murdered a young woman in 1952 and escaped justice for 60 years. You terrorized your wife for 35 years, turning your home into a prison and your marriage into a nightmare. You are a predator of the worst kind, one who hid behind a mask of respectability while destroying the lives of everyone who trusted you." She paused, looking at George with undisguised contempt. "The sentence of this court is as follows. For the murder of Eleanor Marsh, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the assault and abuse of Catherine Peacock, an additional 25 years, to be served consecutively. You will die in prison, Mr. Peacock. And frankly, that is exactly what you deserve." George Peacock was led away in chains. He didn't look at Catherine. He didn't look at anyone. The mask he'd worn for 80 years had finally cracked, and there was nothing underneath but emptiness. The trial of Daniel Marsh took place 3 months later. It was a more complicated case, legally speaking. Daniel had confessed to kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. There was no disputing the facts. The only question was whether the jury would show leniency, given the circumstances. Catherine testified on Daniel's behalf. She told the jury that Daniel had saved her life, that without his intervention, George would have recovered from his injuries, tracked her down, and killed her. That Daniel's 22 years of vigilance had kept her safe and ensured that George would eventually face justice. Daniel Marsh did what the justice system failed to do, Catherine said. He held a murderer accountable. He protected a victim, and he never stopped fighting for his sister's memory. Yes, what he did was illegal, but it was also righteous, and I will be grateful to him for the rest of my life. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In the end, they convicted Daniel of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, but recommended the maximum leniency allowed by law. Judge Walsh agreed. She sentenced Daniel to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 2. Given that Daniel was already 78 years old and in declining health, it was the lightest sentence she could legally impose. "Mr. Marsh," Judge Walsh said at the sentencing, "what you did was wrong. The law does not permit private citizens to kidnap and imprison others, regardless of their crimes. But I understand why you did it, and I believe that your actions, while illegal, ultimately serve the cause of justice. I hope that the remainder of your life will be peaceful, and that you will finally find the closure you've been seeking for 60 years. Daniel Marsh served 18 months in a minimum security facility. He was released in August 2014. He spent his remaining years living with his daughter Rebecca in Vermont, visiting Eleanor's grave every Sunday, finally at peace. He died in his sleep in 2018 at the age of 85. His obituary described him as a devoted brother who never stopped fighting for justice. But what about Catherine? My grandmother didn't live to see the end of Daniel's trial. The cancer that had been slowly killing her finally won on December 23, 2012, 2 months after George was convicted. She died in a hospice in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by the family she had been reunited with after 22 years of separation. My mother Margaret was there, holding her hand. My uncle Robert was there, weeping silently. And I was there, the grandson she had never known, listening as she took her final breaths. Before she died, Catherine asked to speak to me alone. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I need you to do something for me." "Anything," I said. "Go back to the farm. Find the journals I left in the attic. They're still there, behind a false wall. Bring them to the light. Tell our story. Tell it so that other women know they're not alone. Tell it so that other victims know that justice is possible, even when it seems hopeless." "I will," I promised. "I'll tell everyone." Catherine smiled. It was the first real smile I'd ever seen on her face. The smile of a woman who had finally found peace. "I love you, Thomas. Tell your daughters. Tell them to be brave. Tell them that their great-grandmother was a survivor. And tell them that no matter how dark the night seems, the dawn will come." She closed her eyes, and she was gone. George Peacock died in prison on February 14, 2015, Valentine's Day. The irony was not lost on anyone. He was 84 years old, and he had spent the last 3 years of his life in a maximum security cell, surrounded by concrete walls and iron bars. He died alone. No family visited. No friends mourned. The man who had terrorized his wife, murdered at least one woman, and escaped justice for 6 decades ended his life as he deserved, forgotten, unmourned, and completely alone. I didn't attend his funeral. Neither did my mother. Neither did my Uncle Robert. We let the state of Vermont bury him in an unmarked grave, and we never looked back. The farm is mine now. I inherited it after my mother passed away in 2020. For a while, I didn't know what to do with it. The house where my grandmother had suffered so much, where so many terrible things had happened, it seemed wrong to keep it. Wrong to live there. But then I remembered what Catherine had asked me to do. Tell our story. Bring it to the light. I restored the farmhouse. I repaired the roof, replaced the floors, painted the walls bright, cheerful colors that Catherine would have loved. I tore down the door to the root cellar where George had locked her so many times. I planted a garden full of flowers, roses and lilies and marigolds, all the colors George had forbidden. And I found the journals. They were exactly where Catherine said they would be, hidden behind a false wall in the attic. 43 leather-bound notebooks, preserved after all those years, containing the testimony of a woman who refused to be silenced. I've read them all now. Every entry, every page, every heartbreaking word. And I've used them to write this story, the story you've been listening to. The story of George and Catherine Peacock. The story of a monster who thought he could escape justice, and the woman who proved him wrong. The story of a brother who waited 60 years to avenge his sister. The story of an arrest that came 23 years after everyone had given up hope. I live in the farmhouse now with my wife and daughters. The oldest is named Catherine, after her great-great-grandmother. She's 7 years old, and she knows the basics of the story, age-appropriate versions that emphasize bravery and survival and the importance of speaking up when something is wrong. When she's older, I'll tell her the full truth. I'll show her the journals. I'll take her to the courtroom where George was finally convicted, and to the cemetery where Catherine and Eleanor and Daniel are all buried now, at peace at last. I'll teach her that justice sometimes takes decades, that the system doesn't always work the way it should, that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things to make sure that evil doesn't triumph. But I'll also teach her that it's never too late. Never too late to speak up. Never too late to fight back. Never too late to tell the truth, no matter how many years have passed. My grandmother waited 22 years to come forward. Eleanor Marsh waited 60 years to be found. Daniel Marsh waited most of his life to see his sister's killer in handcuffs. But they got there. Justice came. The monster was caged. The victims were vindicated. Sometimes, the arc of the moral universe really does bend toward justice. It just bends slowly. So slowly that you might lose hope along the way. But don't lose hope. That's what Catherine would tell you. Don't give up. Don't stay silent. And don't let the monsters win. The Peacock farm is beautiful now. The fields are green in summer, golden in fall, white with snow in winter. The house is full of light and laughter and love. The ghosts that once haunted these walls have been laid to rest. This is the house that kept secrets. But the secrets are out now. The disappeared have been found. The guilty have been punished. And the survivors are finally home. George Peacock is dead and buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten by history. Catherine Peacock is remembered as a hero, a survivor, a woman who refused to be broken. And their story, our story, will live on forever. Because some secrets are too important to stay buried. And some justice is too precious to give up on, no matter how long it takes.